Welcome! Here's a beautiful china display for showing off your fine china. And we'll make it this time on WoodWorks. Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. This china display is inspired by the work of the famous architects Greene and Greene. It features an open framework, which is an ideal setting for your fine china. The warm red tones of the mahogany shelves and back panel are bordered by sections of Wenge. This dark wood provides rich accents in the narrow frame, as well as contrasting trim for the shelves. In addition, Wenge is used for the flowing curves of the side supports, which are highlighted by brass pins. This piece is not only strong and functional, but beautiful. Now this Wenge is a little bit expensive. It'll run you about $14 a board foot, and that's why we've only used it on the frame and on the trim. But by using a small amount of Wenge, we've added a really nice accent to our display piece. Now we'll start by making these curved portions of our frame. And to do that, we're going to be using these templates that we've made out of 1/2" MDF. Now we've carefully laid out these templates, and we've cut them out on the bandsaw, and then we shaped them by hand with a pattern maker's rasp. And that gives us this nice curved profile that has a step-down motif. So we'll take these templates, double stick tape them down to our boards of Wenge, and then we can rough cut out the profile. But before we do that, it's important to note that we've already jointed this edge flat, and that will serve as a reference point for the joinery that we're going to cut later on. Here's a good tip for cutting out the profiles on your bandsaw. By installing a 1/4" bimetal blade, you can make the job of cutting a hardwood like Wenge a lot easier. Next, we install a flush-bearing bit in the router table to follow the templates and clean up the profiles. After we flush trimmed the curved pieces for the top and bottom of our frame, we milled up these straight pieces on the table saw for the sides. Now you can see from this example of our frame that these straight side pieces connect the top and the bottom of our frame. Now for our joinery, we used a combination of techniques. For the top, we used a spline with 2 slots to join them together. For the bottom, we used a spline with a slot and a mortise technique. Now we did that because this curved rail is actually offset about 1 inch from the bottom of our side piece, and a mortise is a better choice here. We start by cutting the mortises for the sides of our frame on the multi-router, using a 1/4" mortising bit. Then, using the same bit, we cut the slots that will join the top and bottom to the sides of our frame. Next, we square up the mortises using a sharp chisel. We've dry clamped our frame together so that we can check the fit of our joinery. But in order to do that, first we had to mill up some splines, just like these, out of some 1/4" Wenge stock. And we milled them to a width that would fit both our slots and our mortises. Now the reason that we did this dry clamp is to rehearse for our glue up. Now that's important because you want to know exactly where your clamps are going to go before you put the glue on. That way you eliminate any possible problems. Now we anticipated that gluing up this curved frame was going to be a challenge. So we came up with making these support blocks. Now these are cut out to match this curved profile, and that way we have something for the clamp to grab onto and pull these joints tight. Next, we'll cut a rabbet for the back panel. After the glue dried on our frame, we brought it over here to the router table so we could trim off this excess spline material. Now to do that, we're using a flush bearing bit, After we've trimmed off the last excess bit of spline material, then we'll install our rabbiting bit. Now we'll use this to cut a rabbet that's 1/2 inch deep by 3/8 of an inch wide. And we'll cut that rabbet into the back of our frame, so that way we have a recess to glue in our mahogany plywood back panel later on. The splines are small, so we can trim them in one pass. The Wenge tends to splinter, so for the rabbet, we raise the bit in gradual increments to avoid chip out. And we also climb mill the frame in difficult sections, taking care to meet the bit gradually. Next, using our plunge router and an 1/8 inch radius bit, we round over the inside and outside edges of our frame. Then, we use a chisel to square up the corners of the rabbet so the back panel will fit into our frame. We're using this mock-up of our china display to mark the center lines of our shelves onto our frame. Now we're going to need these later on to make sure that our shelves line up correctly. Now that we've got that done, we're going to take this piece of mahogany plywood and we'll slide this underneath our Wenge frame. Now with this in place, we'll take our pencil and we'll scribe along the side of our rabbet, and that'll create an outline for our jigsaw to follow, so then we can cut out our back panel and fit it into our frame. A few strokes with a block plane and smoothing with a pattern maker's rasp help to get a good fit for our panel. Now, our panel is ready to glue into the back of our frame. After spreading the glue in the rabbet, we drop the panel into place. Then, after flipping the assembly over, we use clamps to evenly apply pressure all along the perimeter of the rabbet and check to see that there are no gaps. While the glue is drying on our frame and back panel, we can start making the shelves. We're going to make 3 of them. One that'll go here, here, and here. Now the length will all be the same, but we'll be making 3 different widths to accommodate the different sizes of your china. Now for our stock, we're going to be using some 1/2 inch mahogany plywood, and we'll start by ripping it to width on the table saw. We cut the top shelf 3 inches wide, the middle 3 5/8 inches, and the bottom 5 1/4 inches. Then we cut them each to the same length, 45 5/8 inches. Next, we cut some long strips of Wenge to use as trim to cover the exposed edges of the plywood shelves. Then, at the router table, we use an 1/8 inch radius bit to round over the edges of the trim. With our Wenge trim milled up, we're ready to glue it to our shelves. Our trim serves 2 functions. Number 1, it's going to stay up about 1/4 inch proud on the top of the shelf, and that'll serve to hold our china plates in place. Number 2, it'll hang down on the bottom about 3/16 of an inch, and that's an aesthetic choice. Now, in order to accomplish that, we're going to be using this piece of plywood. This is a 3/16 of an inch thick spacer. So, we'll add some glue to our shelf, we'll set it on top of our spacer, and then we can clamp our trim in place. Now here's a tip. If we take 2 of these assemblies and we put them together face to face, we can utilize 1 set of clamps and save some time. After the trim is dried on the front of the shelves, we cut the excess off at the table saw. Then we glue on the pieces for the sides of our shelves. The glue is dried on our trim, so our shelves are basically complete. Next, we can begin the process of fitting our shelves to our frame and back panel. We took some measurements off of our frame and back panel so that we can make these notches in the back of our shelves. Now, what we're after is to make sure that the wenge on the side of our shelves sits flush up against the wenge on our frame. And we also want to make sure that the back of our shelves sits flush up against our mahogany back panel. That way, we'll have a good solid fit, and it'll help with our biscuit joinery later on. We've already cut the notches in the back of our shelves. Now we're getting ready to cut the notches in the front of our shelves. Now we're using this template for the side support pieces that we'll be making later on. And we know that we want our side support pieces to be centered in our frame. So that means we'll be making some marks 5/16 of an inch in from the edge of the shelf. And we also know that we want our support pieces to be 5/16 of an inch proud from the end of the shelf. So we'll use this spacer block, and then we've taken some green tape, we've put this on the edge of the shelf. Now we can scribe some pencil marks, and then we'll take our side supports to the table saw and cut out the notches. Now we're ready to join our shelves to our back panel. To do that, we're going to be using a biscuit joiner. Now I've got it set at 0, and that way we can use the smallest possible biscuit so we don't cut through the back of our plywood panel. We've got a straight edge clamped in place to ensure that we have it properly aligned with our shelves. We're going to be cutting 5 slots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that way we can distribute the load over the length of our shelf. So that everything's set up, we'll go ahead and start cutting our slots. After we cut the slots in the back panel, we make matching slots on the back of all 3 shelves. Then we put yellow glue in our slots and on our biscuits, and attach our shelves to the back of our china display, clamping them firmly into position. Now that the glue is dried on our shelves, we can begin to make the side support pieces that tie the edge of our shelves into our frame. Now we'll start by taking this template that we've used earlier. We'll double stick tape it down to a piece of wenge, and then we can take it to the bandsaw and rough cut out our side support. We're using the oscillating spindle sander to shape these narrow side shelf supports. Now the beauty of this machine is that the grinding action won't catch the wood and possibly break it. And also it's ideally suited for doing curved work because the curved shape of the drum is going to match our curved profile. And finally, that oscillating action that goes up and down tends not to leave those scallop marks that are usually associated with the drum sanders. We sand down the wenge until it's flush with our curved template. Then we round the edges of our side supports with an 1/8 inch radius bit. The chalk marks indicate the edges we don't want rounded, where the supports will join the shelves. We have our side supports taped into position. But before we can glue our side supports into position, we need to make some layout marks for some holes that we're going to drill for our brass dowels. Now these brass dowels will serve to make sure that our china can't possibly slip off the end of our shelf. Now we want to make sure that our brass dowels are situated in the flat spot of our side support. And once we have these layout marks in place, then we can remove our side support and drill our holes. Some green tape on the drill bit helps to clearly indicate the depth we want. Once the holes are drilled, we glue our side supports in place with 5-minute epoxy. When the epoxy is dry, we drill some holes into the side supports, throwing them in at an angle. Then, we drive in some brass pins to tie the supports into our shelves. Next, we get ready to add the finish. We're doing some final sanding and flushing up our brass dowels using a sanding block with some 220 grit sandpaper. Now after we're done with this, all we have to do is drill some holes for mounting our display cabinet to the wall. We drill 4 holes in the corners of our frame and countersink them. Now here's a little tip for mounting our china display to the wall. We're going to be using these ebony caps to cover up the screw holes. Now we've milled these up 3/8 of an inch square. We put a little bevel around the edge. Now in order to mount these, we have to chop a square hole. So for that, we're going to be using our hollow chisel mortising bit. Now after we've used this to define the edges of our hole, we'll come back with a chisel and pare down about 1/8 of an inch, and that'll give us a recess for our ebony caps to sit into. The last step is to add the finish. A red mahogany stain will deepen the tones on the mahogany plywood as well as the Wenge sections. The open frame construction of the display adds an airy feel, making it the perfect backdrop for your china. The symmetrical step-down pattern of the curved Wenge frame and side rails give the piece an Asian feel. And the warm red tones of the mahogany shelves and back panel, highlighted by the Wenge trim, make this an eye-catching addition for your home. Here's some good advice for mounting our china display to the wall. Now after you've installed the screws, don't glue in the ebony tenons. Instead, use some double-stick tape. That way, if you ever need to move the piece, you can easily access the screws. I'm David Marks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you right here next time on WoodWorks.